Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It is a great pleasure to be joined today by the IDSF Director of International Relations, Elie Pierpz. Elie, thank you so much for sitting with me today.
Thank you, Moshe. Pleasure to be here.
Elie, yesterday, as is being described by President Trump himself, was a historic day for peace. President Trump, together with Prime Minister Netanyahu, shared the plan for eternal peace in the Middle East, bringing an end to this war in Gaza and bringing much more to that, bringing eternal peace to the Middle East. Elie, what are your thoughts on that? Are we going to be seeing eternal peace in the next few days?
I think we are taking, it's a small step, but a huge step for mankind. I think to paraphrase Neil Armstrong, I think we're heading in that direction. It's not going to achieve everything instantaneously, but this is a talich, this is a pathway that seems extremely good to Israel. Basically, to sum up the plan in one phrase, this is a Hamas surrender without actually saying that they're surrendering. It allows Israel to achieve really all of its war aims, the 5 war aims that the prime minister and the government has laid out from the beginning of the war. Frankly, the war aims that I'm sure you've heard General Avivi speak countless times in this webinar over the last many months. Talked about the destruction of Hamas as a viable entity, the release of all hostages, both those alive and even those who have already been killed, the demilitarization of Gaza, Israeli security control over the Gaza Strip, and the creation of a new civil administration that excludes Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. On that last point, I know there are some concerns over because in some of the discussions, there is mention of the Palestinian Authority, but it's speaking of a reformed Palestinian Authority that would have a say, not that they are in any kind of real control. And the reformed Palestinian Authority, certainly the devil is in the details, but it's clear both from an Israeli perspective and from an American perspective, there's really not something that the Palestinian Authority has the ability to do. We can talk a little bit more about the Palestinian Authority and what kind of reforms would be necessary later on. But I think that's the first thing is to understand is that this is an ability for Israel to declare victory, God willing, get back all of our hostages, put ourselves and get all of our hostages back in one full swoop, not delayed over time, over the matter of months, and have Hamas play games where they, bring back the remains of some Arab instead of an Israeli. No, something that would happen in the first 48 or 72 hours, that there would be that immediate, we will be getting back all of our hostages, and that will create a tremendous sense of elation, of a certain trauma that goes away, and frankly puts Israel in a much different situation in order, if we are forced to go and fight again, which I think most of us here expect, anticipate at some point that there will be more fighting. Hamas is not going to just walk away that simply. But if our hostages aren't there, our fighting is extremely different. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. Question is, why would Hamas accept something like this? And I think that is something that is critical. As we're recording this right now, there seem to be some indications from American media suggesting that Hamas is leaning towards accepting it. And it's clear, this is not something that Hamas wants. Hamas understands that it is at the end of its rope. Hamas understands that they are in significant trouble. They are in significant isolation. I mean, think about it. If you're Hamas, you're sitting here and watching how Israel and President Trump are really handling everything completely on their own. Last week, they were diplomatically as successful, as high as they could be. They had convinced a number of weak European countries, and really European countries who were petrified of an anti-Israel element in their own countries, petrified of them, so threw them a bone, say we're going to recognize a Palestinian state and hope that that doesn't empower Hamas. Obviously, Hamas took those unilateral announcements by the UK, by France, by Canada, Australia, and others as a huge win, as a justification for what they launched on October 7th, 2 years ago, that they were able to achieve, from their perspective, a political goal that was out of reach for the last century. They were not, they had the Palestinian narrative, they had not been able to achieve a state. And finally, through October 7th and through the 2 years that had gone by, again, from their perspective, there was a lot of sacrifice. Many Arabs died, but it was all worth it because now they got a lot of more mainstream, high-profile countries who are seen as allies to Israel, separating, creating friction with Israel. Despite Israel's resistance, they were going to recognize a Palestinian state. Hamas was as happy as can be, and they thought things were going really well. Now, what's happened? Literally everything has changed around. Bibi, the prime minister, is sitting with President Trump, negotiating not just Israel's future, but frankly, Hamas's future. And who are they doing it with? They're doing it with Hamas's biggest backers. They're doing it with Qatar. They're doing it with Turkey. Qatar and Turkey, they are desperate to stay on Trump's good side. And as much as the media have been saying that Trump was losing patience with Israel, we're seeing right now, no, Trump was losing patience with Qatar. Trump was losing patience with Turkey and the elements that are supporting Hamas. President Trump understands what Israel is doing all that it can to achieve peace, to get back its hostages, something that clearly the president identifies with. And while certainly he would want things to go as and trying to put some pressure on both sides, he understands that the key is pressuring Hamas through Qatar, through Turkey, and now he's putting significant pressure on them. So if I'm Hamas, I'm really quite petrified by what's going on.
So you see this as a good deal for Israel, but what are the concerns, right? What are the problems that you think could arise and could be a liability for Israel in this deal?
One of the concerns is this idea of demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, and that there will still be humanitarian aid going into Gaza. That's part of the agreement, is that more humanitarian aid would be going in. And I would say those are probably my two biggest concerns of the agreement. How are those going to be monitored? How are we going to ensure that Hamas actually is going to be demilitarizing themselves, demilitarizing the Gaza Strip? How are we going to be sure that humanitarian aid that is going into Gaza is not going to be compromised? There's not going to be smuggling. We've seen all sorts of efforts to try to smuggle. Many we've been able to stop, but for sure some has gotten through. And the question is now, under this new arrangement, is Israel going to have a better access, a better opportunity to police both the demilitarization and humanitarian aid? I would argue that actually this puts us in a slightly stronger position than we currently are. Even today, there is humanitarian aid going in. It's something that Israel has determined is absolutely necessary to continue with the support that we're getting internationally, even though it seems like we don't have a lot. There is still a need for us to have some level of support internationally, even from the US. But what Israel did and worked with a Gaza humanitarian fund to facilitate the humanitarian aid seems like a very similar approach to how Israel is going to be handling both the humanitarian aid and the demilitarization should Hamas agree to the Netanyahu-Trump plan. What do I mean by that? If you remember, before the GHF went into effect back in the spring, there were constant accusations of famine, and not that that's totally gone away, but the strength of it has mitigated, has become much more limited. Why? Because not only is Israel saying, no, we're not starving anybody, we're providing aid, we're sending in food. it's not just before GHF went into effect, it was just Israel saying that. Now it's Israel and GHF, which is basically part or an extension of America. This is an American organization with mostly, almost exclusively, American staff who are saying and who are doing, frankly, Israel's PR and saying, no, there is no famine going on there. We are providing aid. Hamas is trying to prevent the aid from coming, trying to prevent people from taking the aid. And now it's not just Israel making that case internationally, it's Israel and the Gaza Humanitarian Fund doing that when it comes to the specific issue of humanitarian aid and famine. When it comes to this new situation, again, assuming Hamas agrees to takes the agreement, and they begins the process of returning all of our hostages in the immediate 48 or 72 hours. I think I've seen differing opinions what that will be, and obviously I'm sure Hamas will try to make some changes. But I think 72 hours would be acceptable to Israel if we can get them all back in one stop. If in that case we go into some sort of agreement and we start dealing with monitoring how Hamas is demilitarizing, how Hamas is how we are providing humanitarian aid into Gaza, I think we will be doing so with certainly much more international legitimacy. Does not mean that no one's going to complain and no one's going to argue and say that Israel is not living up to its standards and what it agreed to. But I think that there is going to be a real interest by Qatar and Turkey to continue to make this work because they don't want to. If neither of them think that their relationship with Trump is stronger than Israel's relationship with Trump. Obviously, there needs to be execution of this deal. There are certainly going to be pitfalls. Qatar and Turkey are not going to play necessarily fairly. There are going to be challenges, but I would say we are in a much stronger circumstance when it is Israel and the U.S., or even if it's Israel alone dealing with Turkey and Qatar, versus what seemed to be Israel fending off countries all around the world who are making accusations that Israel was, genocide, whatever the accusations are. There were so many accusations against Israel. Now let's focus on Turkey and Qatar, something that's very practical that will only really come to after we have already received back our hostages. And I'll say on top of that, another point which is really beneficial is it is creating friction and a natural friction that has occurred between the U.S. and Qatar. As an Israeli, it's not for us to try to get involved and to try to harm relations between the U.S. and any other country, any country that the U.S. sees as their ally. But there's no doubt that from an Israeli perspective, Qatar is a very difficult and is an adversary, say an enemy. Well, we're not officially enemy states, but obviously Qatar is responsible or has a significant responsibility for the buildup of Hamas and October 7th and so much more, not to mention Al Jazeera, which you could argue is even worse than everything else, and the poisoning of minds in higher education institutions in the US and Europe and around the world. So Qatar is a very problematic country. The US and most Western countries have favorable relations with Qatar. And at this point, there is no doubt that the US-Qatar relationship is being strained, is being tested. And I think, I think that is something that is not going to get a lot of attention right now. Long term, I think this is extremely important. How the Prime Minister and I would say Ron Dermer navigate these next little bit and try to, again, create a little bit of daylight between the U.S. and Qatar if Qatar does not live up to its commitments to shepherd this properly, to make sure that Hamas is actually demilitarized. I think that either option is good for Israel. Either Qatar is able to really use its influence and move Hamas out, make sure Hamas is not a threat to us, or if not, then there will be, I think, some sort of negative impact between the U.S.-Qatar relations, which I think is beneficial for us. Now, I know there's been a lot of concern about the prime minister was forced to apologize publicly to Qatar for the attack that Israel did targeting the Hamas leadership in Qatar. I'll say I think that it is it's kind of laughable in some ways that this is what happened. Obviously, it's not something. It was done, and in some circles, in the Middle East, image is very important. But I'll say my suggestion was that the prime minister should have apologized 3 times: once for the attack that already happened, and 2 in advance in case we need to do it again. And I think that it is something that is consequential. The prime minister said something, he apologized. No one actually thinks that he really believes that we did something wrong. He knew it was something that needed to be done at the slim chance that we could be saving 40 or 20 lives. It is worth the prime minister making a statement like that in order to allow the Qataris to use their full leverage on Hamas and obviously potentially ending the war, which really has the potential of saving many more Israeli lives. Israeli soldiers might potentially be killed in the ensuing attack. And I think, again, take a look at it from Hamas's perspective. Hamas had been relying on Qatari protection, and Qatar was upset with Israel, wasn't doing anything, wasn't going to be putting any pressure on Hamas. Bibi says I'm sorry, really, as we've been saying over the last few weeks, the slichot leading up to the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Jewish holidays, one of the major prayers is al chet, on this sin, and you apologize. You apologize for saying it. He added one more, al chet, which I don't think he took all that seriously. Hamas must be saying, really? Bibi says an apology that he doesn't really mean, and all of a sudden now Qatar is going to be putting pressure on me, pressure on Hamas security, Hamas autonomy. He's literally bartering Hamas's future for a phone call in the presence of President Trump. As infuriating as that phone call was for many Israelis and many supporters of Israel around the world, it really must be quite frightening and terrifying for Hamas. I want to add, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, just look at where things have changed from last week. Last week, over on Rosh Hashanah, that's when France and Saudi unveiled their initiative, trying to isolate Israel. These were allies of Israel who were saying that they were going to unilaterally recognize the state of Palestine. And hopefully that was going to lead to, I'm not sure exactly what it was supposed to lead to, other than the pacifying of the domestic crowd in all those countries that were anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and pro-Palestinian. And immediately after that, there was sense and certainly talk amongst the anti-government media and other spokesmen saying that Israel is isolated, their prime minister is doing a terrible job. We have at the same time when the prime minister goes and spoke on Friday before the UN, so many diplomats walked out. And there was this sense, nobody likes us. We are in such trouble. We're doing such bad. And our international diplomacy is a complete failure. And what the prime minister said, which he's actually right, is that if you walk out, it says more about you than about us. And more than that, the prime minister actually was underplaying it. By walking out and by doing their unilateral declaration last week, they've demonstrated their absolute impotence. They're completely irrelevant from anything consequential. What they said, what they declared, spoke very well and worked very well at the UN, has absolutely no impact on the ground. If anything, it has a more negative impact on the ground, and demonstrates to an Israeli public, and obviously most of the Israeli public is supportive of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and certainly is against a Palestinian state. For those outliers who were still hoping from their perspective that the way to achieve peace with the Palestinians is just to give them a state. Who really cares? And God will protect us because from a security perspective, it makes no sense. The reality is, when you see these countries last week unilaterally recognizing the state of Palestine, even the elements within Israel understand, wow, the Palestinian state is a threat to the state of Israel, and even more Israelis became supportive of Judea and Samaria as part of Israel. We'll get to that in a second, Judea and Samaria. But I think what they found out is that Israel and President Trump are leading a coalition that is make Israel much stronger and demonstrates that Europe really has very limited say. Either you get on board with President Trump, as Germany has, again, supported this initiative, and I presume the countries that unilaterally recognize Palestine will also get on board if they want to try to demonstrate any kind of relevance.
Elie, last week, everyone was up in arms about President Trump's statement about sovereignty. And then as this plan now rolls out, there's no mention of sovereignty of Judea and Samaria one way or the other. So what is the plan right now? What is the future of Israel declaring sovereignty over Judea and Samaria? And is that really an issue that we should be focused on? Many people think it is. And many people will say if you don't push for sovereignty, you're neglecting Judea and Samaria, and you're doing a tremendous disservice to the state of Israel. Is that true? Is that your opinion?
Certainly, there is certain disappointment by many about the lack of declaring sovereignty in Judea and Samaria at this time. There was a lot of push for it. There was a push that should be the response to the unilateral declaration by France and the UK and others. And from a policy perspective, certainly that makes the most sense. The question is, from a political perspective, is that the thing to be focusing on? The attitude of the Trump administration is consistent, makes sense, is not anti-Judea and Samaria, and I think is something that we should take exclusively as that, and not to infer anything more out of them. But I think more than that. In the same way that the declaration by France and the UK for a Palestinian state is irrelevant, to a certain extent, a declaration of sovereignty also has limited impact if it is not accepted, by others. The whole point of a declaration is to demonstrate legitimacy. And the result is going to be more countries are going to be not considering or not accepting Israel's sovereignty, then you actually haven't accomplished very much. Practically, a mistake that we've made within Israel and within the sovereignty in Judea and Samaria movement is that there's been a focus on trying to get as many people outside of Israel to support sovereignty. So getting elected officials from the US and from Europe to visit and to say they understand the importance, they understand the significance from a security perspective, from a religious perspective, from a moral perspective. There's been an influx of many high-profile personalities. The focus that we need to be doing in Israel is to try to get Israelis from Little Israel, Israelis from Tel Aviv, Israelis from Ra'anana, Israelis from Beersheba, to have a greater appreciation of the importance of Judea and Samaria. And the more we can make sovereignty in Judea and Samaria a mainstream Israeli issue, that you have to be supportive of it, that's how there's going to be success. If Judea and Samaria is seen as a polarizing issue, then it's going to be very challenging for the US or any country really to embrace it as we want it to be.
Okay, so the Board of Peace that is going to be headed by President Trump, what are your thoughts on that? Is that Israel bringing its closest ally even closer, or is that Israel giving up full control of the future of Gaza to the US or other outside entities?
So it's a great question. And like what I said earlier, it's going to come down to execution. Israel expects, when you have any kind of board of peace or you have any kind of entity that's going to be monitoring any kind of demilitarization, which is really the goal is to create some sort of demilitarization of the whole Gaza Strip so that it can be available for redevelopment and hopefully, a better life for everybody, including Israel. It comes down to who's going to be willing to sacrifice themselves for this. Are there going to be other countries that are going to send soldiers that are actually going to risk their lives against Hamas? The reality is it's still going to be Israeli soldiers who are going to have to do the hard work. And the question is whether we do it without the primatur of the international legitimacy that this will provide for us, this board of peace, or not. If we get to a situation that it's supposed to be both President Trump, Tony Blair, there will be other international figures who will be participating. Tony Blair, I would not consider him a friend. It is interesting that he's joining at this point. Again, quite harmful to the current UK government that Tony Blair is joining at this point. But if there ends up being a situation where Tony Blair ends up being problematic to Israel, I don't think there is any chance that Israel is going to sit back and it's going to let Tony Blair dictate Israel's security considerations. Israel has been very comfortable over the last 2 years with allies criticizing us, and even worse. And if it means that one thing that our enemies have learned, that we're not worried about that. We don't consider criticism from allies radioactive. That's not kryptonite anymore. We've experienced that. We've handled that for the last couple of years. And if Tony Blair or this board of peace doesn't like what Israel is doing, I think it is very unlikely that Israel is going to be listening to them. Israel is going to continue to make it clear what Israel needs to do in order to provide security, as President Trump seems also to understand that without Israeli security, there will not be security in Gaza. Security in Gaza and the demilitarization of Gaza, the redevelopment of Gaza, is reliant on Israeli presence and Israeli security control in the overall region. One last thought as we want to wrap up. We're going into Yom Kippur. Tomorrow is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and a day that we understand as a Jewish people, that we have to come in as an entire nation. It's one of the differences between Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur. That Yom Kippur is a national Day of Atonement. It's not as much individual, but it's more national. And I think one of the things that is happening is you look at how the Israeli political leadership, which has been extremely polarized, you even look at some of the hostage families, they are all supportive of this initiative. We'll see what Hamas says. We'll see how the first few days go. But if we could have some sort of breakthrough where the entire main Israeli body politic, maybe extremes on either side, but 80% of the Israeli public is supportive of initiative going into the Jewish high holiday of Yom Kippur. To me, we cannot have success in Israel from a security perspective unless we have unity. You look at the level of disunity we had going into October 7th, one follows the other, and at the same point, unity leads to success, leads to peace, and it will hopefully lead us to a year and a Yom Kippur where we can pray for forgiveness, pray for peace, and pray for the success of this initiative.
Amen, Elie. Beautiful words to take us into Yom Kippur. It's a great pleasure to speak with you, to learn from you. You spoke about Qatar and your views on the Qatari involvement in all of this plan. So, a cliffhanger to all of our wonderful viewers and supporters. We will be having a briefing tomorrow. It's Erev Yom Kippur. It's right before Yom Kippur, but we're going to have a briefing because it's super important. General Avivi is going to share his thoughts on the Trump plan, and he's also going to talk about Qatar. So don't miss tomorrow. Super important. Elie, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters. We'll be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.